Fernão de Magalhães, later known as Fernando de Magallanes, better known as Ferdinand Magellan, is a rather famous guy. In fact, he's really only famous for one thing in particular. I mean, there is a strait named after him, the Strait of Magellan, which passes through the southern tip of South America, but the real reason he's famous is for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe, to sail all the way around the Earth in a full circle. That really is Magellan's claim to fame, except for one thing. He never even did that. Did you know that despite claiming all the credit posthumously, Magellan only made it about 3/4 of the way around the world? One of his 5 ships did return to Spain after a mostly disastrous voyage, but Magellan was no longer on board. So who should really claim the credit? Who was the first person to circumnavigate the Earth? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. June is ship month, I guess. Just getting real nautical this month. Just sort of happened that way. But this topic, though, Magellan and his famed circumnavigation of the globe, this is like the perfect topic for History Fix. I mean, how many of you guys thought that he was the first person to circumnavigate the globe, like that he completed the voyage? I had no idea for most of my life that he never actually made it all the way around. I don't know how I missed that in all of the history classes that I took in high school and in college. I mean, they really push that misconception on you, right? That Magellan was the first one to circumnavigate the Earth. No, he most definitely wasn't. So let's set the record straight today. Also, I've completely lost my mind, and I am testing out a video version of History Fix that's available on YouTube at History Fix Podcast for free for everyone, and also at patreon.com/History Fix Podcast for subscribers, early and ad-free. So if you're not watching it right now, it's basically just my big dumb head talking, and I'll pop up some images from time to time that go along with the story, which is pretty cool. So if you think you'd enjoy having those visuals, I realize I'm sitting in front of my computer talking to myself every week anyway. You guys might as well be able to see me doing that. Plus the pictures, the visuals. So if you think you'd enjoy that, head on over to YouTube or to Patreon so that you can listen and watch. I don't know how long this will last. We'll see if I can keep it going. And that really just comes down to time because this is a whole nother thing that I now have to do. So fun. So who was Magellan? Well, he was born into a noble family in Portugal in 1480. So for some context, Christopher Columbus' first voyage to the Americas was in 1492, when Magellan was 12 years old. So they're living at the same time, but Columbus was just about 30 years older than Magellan. So Magellan was born into a noble family, but both of his parents died when he was young. And so he went to serve as a court page in Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal. During this time, pages were young boys who acted as servants or attendants to nobility or even to knights. So they would deliver messages, serve food, clean armor, that sort of thing. And Magellan wasn't a page to just any old Portuguese noble. He was the page to Queen Leonor, who was the wife of the current king of Portugal, John II. She was also the sister of the king that came after John, King Manuel I. So these are pretty great connections that he's making even as a young child. In 1505, when Magellan was 25 years old, so he's sort of moved on from being a page, he's sort of outgrown that, that's like a little boy thing to do, he enlisted in a Portuguese fleet that was heading to the Indian Ocean, bouncing around the coasts of Africa and India. And the purpose of this mission was to establish a Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean so that they could use it to travel to the Spice Islands in the East Indies. So these islands were also called the Moluccas, and they're essentially like the eastern part of Indonesia. And this is where the good spices are. And Europe is like crazy for spices right now. It's the whole thing. They're all about spices. Spain and Portugal are kind of duking it out for spices at this point. Spices. And then the rest of Europe, they're a little bit behind when it comes to the whole like world domination in search of spices thing right now. But Portugal and Spain, they're all over it. Gotta have those cloves or whatever, nutmeg. Like literally that's what this is all about. I'm like, I have had a shaker of nutmeg in my spice cabinet for, I don't even want to admit to you how long. I use it once a year, Thanksgiving, when I make a pumpkin pie. And that's it. What are you guys doing with all of this nutmeg? But after Christopher Columbus does his thing in the 1490s, please refer to episodes 80 and 81 for more on that. After he sort of stumbles upon the Americas, Spain and Portugal come to a little agreement, okay? Because they both want it, right? They want it all. Doesn't really matter that there's already a whole thriving civilizations there. They want it, and so they argue with each other over who gets it. And they come to an agreement, and they sign the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. So this drew a line, the line of demarcation, north to south, through what's now Brazil. And it said that as far as future exploration and conquest is concerned, Spain gets everything west of the line and Portugal gets everything east. Like, how brazen was this? Like, yeah, you guys get that half of the earth and we'll take this half. What? What about all the other people on earth already in those places? Like, what were they thinking? But also, it doesn't really work because earth is a circle. It's a sphere. You can't just be like, you go that way and we'll go this way, because you're eventually going to meet back up. Like, you need another line on the other side of Earth for this to work. But they're not thinking clearly, obviously. So anyway, this is why Portugal is now terrorizing the Indian Ocean, because Portugal gets to go east and Spain gets to go west. They both want those spices. India, Africa, the Indian Ocean, these all lie between Portugal and their eastward route to the Spice Islands. Now, Spain can't go that way. They got most of the Americas in this deal, but they can't go east. They have to go west if they want to get to the Spice Islands. And they honestly have no idea how difficult that is. They're like, sure, we'll just pop across South America, easy peasy. They have no idea that a whole nother ocean, the largest ocean on Earth by a lot, stands in their way. So right now, Magellan is Team Portugal. He's trying to help establish Portugal's route to the spices. In 1511, he was part of a fleet that conquered Malacca, which is in present-day Malaysia. Controlling Malacca was a big deal because it meant controlling most of the trade routes in that region. Also, while in Malacca, this will matter later, Magellan essentially kidnaps an indigenous Malay man that ends up being called Enrique, although something tells me that wasn't his actual name. So he takes Enrique with him, he enslaves him, of course, and he takes him back to Portugal, and he keeps him with him going forward to use as a translator during future voyages to that region. In 1514, Magellan is injured during a skirmish in Morocco, and this injury causes him to walk with a limp, actually for the rest of his life. He's sort of laid up back in Portugal at this point, and he asks the then king, King Manuel, who's the brother of the lady he used to page for, he asks him to increase his pension as a reward for having been injured in the service of the crown, but the king refuses. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, unfounded reports of irregular conduct on his part had reached the king. After the siege of Azamor, Magellan was accused of having sold a portion of the war spoils back to the enemy. Refusing Magellan's request for a reward, Manuel ordered him back to Morocco. Early in 1516, Magellan renewed his petition. The king, refusing once more, told him he might offer his services elsewhere. End quote. So unfounded accusations, other sources said that the king just plain didn't like Magellan. Either way, he gave him permission to take his services elsewhere. And so he did. He did offer those services elsewhere. Magellan went to Spain, much like Christopher Columbus had done when other countries refused to fund his harebrained scheme. It worked for Columbus, and guess what? It worked for Magellan too. He goes to Spain and he says, you guys got west, right? In the Treaty of Tordesillas, you have to go west if you want to get to the Spice Islands. We don't even know what's over there, at all, but I'm willing to give it a go. Give me some ships and a crew, and I will find a westward passage to the Spices for you. Patrick J. Kiger writes for History.com, quote, "In accomplishing that, the expedition would circumnavigate the planet for the first time in human history. It was an audacious plan, one that involved sailing through thousands of miles of uncharted waters and finding a previously undiscovered passage through the Americas from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. But Magellan, who believed that it was God's will for him to succeed, was confident of success." End quote. He ends up leaving Spain in September of 1519 with 5 ships and 260 sailors. They sail west toward the Americas in the hopes of finding a passage through that will take them to the East Indies. But turns out Magellan really had no idea where he was going, much like Columbus before him. His understanding of the geography that lay between Spain and the Spice Islands in the East Indies was very, very mistaken. Okay, so he thought the Spice Islands were much farther east than they actually were. He had no idea how large the Pacific Ocean was, or even that there was a whole ocean between the Americas and the Spice Islands. So for all he knew, the islands he sought were just off the coast of Chile. Kiger writes, quote, "Magellan told Spanish officials that his plan was to sail along the eastern coast of South America until the land ended, and even showed them a globe to illustrate the route. Though he didn't know the actual distance, he estimated that the round trip from the Spice Islands would take no more than 2 years. But Magellan was vague about how he would get past the Americas. According to historian Jerry Broughton's A History of the World in 12 Maps, a priest and author named Bartolomé de las Casas, who witnessed the presentation, asked Magellan, "What will you do if you find no strait to pass into the other sea?" Magellan dodged the question. End quote. So he is very much winging this. Las Casas' concerns turn out to be valid. Magellan and his crew, his 5 ships and 260 some men, they do have a hard time finding that passage through South America, and in the process, they lose one of the ships, the Santiago, which wrecked during a storm and had to be abandoned. So they've had a very rough passage across the Atlantic, and then they lose a ship. Tensions are super high. On top of that, this was a pretty rough and tumble crew to begin with. They came from a lot of different countries, they spoke all different languages, and many of them disliked Magellan. We know this because of a first-hand account written by a guy named Antonio Pigafetta. He served during the expedition as Magellan's assistant and also as a chronicler, documenting the whole thing. Thank you for that, dude. And he kept a detailed diary, which he later published into a book called Magellan's Voyage Around the World. So in this diary turned book, he wrote, quote, "The captains who accompanied him hated him exceedingly. I know not why, unless because he was a Portuguese and they Spaniards." End quote. So it takes them about a year after reaching the coast of South America to actually find a passage through. And there's a lot of unrest and outright mutiny going on during this time. First, in December of 1519, soon after reaching South America, an officer on one of the ships called the Victoria, a guy named Antonio Salomon, is tried and executed by strangulation for sexually assaulting an apprentice. And then one of the captains on one of the ships, named Juan de Cartagena, accuses Magellan of being a Portuguese double agent who's actually trying to sabotage the Spanish mission, right? Portugal and Spain are in direct competition over these spices. So he accuses him of being a double agent. And this escalates. And by April of 1520, Cartagena and some other men have come up with a plot to kill Magellan, right? Mutiny. According to Kiger, quote, "According to an account by Portuguese historian Gaspar Correa, Magellan anticipated their treachery. When they tried to strike, an officer loyal to him pulled a dagger and cut the throat of mutineer Luis de Mendoza, whose corpse was then hung by his feet, so they might see him from the other ships. Magellan captured the other conspirators, and their punishment was brutal. After one captain was beheaded, his body was drawn and quartered as an example of the price for disloyalty. Cartagena, who had tried to hatch a second plot, was left to starve on a small island off the coast. End quote. By November of 1520, Magellan managed to find a way through the bottom tip of South America, a passage that is now called the Strait of Magellan. But there was still a lot of dissent and unrest among the crew. One whole ship, the San Antonio, actually slipped away rather than attempting the crossing through the strait that they found. They were like, peace out, and they turned and they headed back to Spain. So one ship wrecked, right? One abandoned the mission. We're down to just 3 ships now. Okay, so we have the Victoria, the Trinidad, and the Concepcion. Magellan was on the Trinidad, in case you were curious. Okay, they get through the Strait of Magellan and they enter another ocean, an ocean that Magellan names the Pacific Ocean because it seems so peaceful. Yes, Magellan came up with that name. He named the Pacific Ocean. I don't know why I didn't know that either. Now, it might have been peaceful, but it was also very, very large, much larger than he had imagined in his wildest dreams. They just kept sailing and sailing and sailing, and every single day they are expecting to spot land, but they don't, and they don't, and they don't, and it's just going on forever. They're running out of food, they're eating very little, they have to ration their water, and at one point Magellan gets so frustrated by how inaccurate the maps he's been using are that he actually throws them overboard. I'm pretty sure he was hangry. I mean, he throws the maps overboard. And so the crew, they freak out. He threw the maps overboard. What is this guy thinking? But according to historian Lawrence Bergreen, it ended up being for the better, surprisingly. So without the maps, Magellan was forced to navigate by reading the signs of the ocean, the currents, the winds, and he actually navigates much better without the maps. And I found this so interesting. We talked a bit about the skills of Polynesian voyagers in episode 110 about Easter Island. I feel like I talked about it in the Hawaii episode as well, and how they were able to travel all over the Pacific Ocean in these small canoes without any of the technology that Magellan had, right? They didn't have maps or compasses, sextants, and how really until recently, Westerners have been mostly in denial that they had these abilities, that they were able to do this. And I find it ironic that Magellan is having to resort to their methods and it's working better. He reaches the Philippines in March of 1521, about 4 months after leaving South America, and really just barely before his crew starves to death. So he gets to the Philippines in March of 1521. He could have just traded for some spices and kept going back to Spain, like the whole point of the mission. They know the way back to Spain. People have done this leg of the voyage before. But no, Magellan has other ideas. He decides, we came all this way. Let's pop in a little side mission. And he decides he's going to convert the indigenous people there to Christianity, Catholicism. Why not? Once he does this, he'll be able to place them under the authority of the Spanish king. Dude's going to be stoked, right? Spices and human beings, what more could he want? And just like we saw play out in the Americas, some of the indigenous groups go along with it. They convert, they do the dance, because Spain is a powerful ally, right? This is why Manteo was so down to side with the English during the Roanoke voyages. He saw them as potential allies. They have guns and cannons and medals and all kinds of crazy stuff that we need. We need them. Now, not all of the people that Magellan encountered felt that way, though. There were some Wancheses, too. Specifically, Lapu-Lapu, who was the chief of the island of Mactan. He refused to convert and to submit to the authority of Spain, which, same dude. Now, Magellan, if you recall from earlier, had been involved in a lot of military pursuits for Portugal in his youth. He had been all over India and Africa, Morocco, conquering people left and right to secure Portugal's trade route to the spices. So with all that under his belt, he thinks he knows exactly how to deal with Lapu-Lapu. He's going to attack. He's just going to attack him and, make him do what he wants him to do. On April 27th, 1521, Magellan gathers 60 men from his crew and up to 30 native allies to go attack this Lapu guy, right? He's not going to do what they say. He's going down. WWJD, right? It's so crazy, you guys. This is about Christianity, right? Magellan wanted this guy to convert to Christianity, and when he refuses, he decides to go kill him? Does no one actually read the Bible? Does anyone actually know what Jesus preached? The entire foundation of the religion? I assure you it wasn't that. But he goes and he thinks he has the advantage because they have armor and guns and crossbows, and these dudes just have wooden spears. They don't stand a chance. That's what Magellan thinks. Pigafetta wrote about this in his account. He says that Magellan goes with these 90 men to the island of Mactan to attack. But the boats can't get very close to the island because of the rocks. So they have to jump out of the boats and wade to shore where 1,500 indigenous warriors await them. Okay, Magellan and this puny crew, these outsiders, they start to fire on this massive crowd defending their island, and they're way out of they're way outnumbered, and they're in the water, and they can't hit their marks, and the advantage of these super superior weapons is outweighed. And he realizes pretty immediately, oh, we don't have the advantage because it's outweighed by the disadvantage of their position and of their numbers. Pigafetta wrote, quote, "So many were the spears and stones that they hurled at us that we could offer no resistance," end quote. So Magellan is struck in the leg with a poison arrow, and he has his helmet knocked off of his head, but he keeps fighting, right? He keeps fighting, and then a warrior slashes him in the leg, causing him to fall. Now, once on the ground, or in the water, I guess, the warriors swarm him, stabbing him to death. And I hate to say this, I really do, because this is, it's really tragic. It's a really tragic loss of a man's life here, but kind of serves him right. These people on this island, they were not the antagonizers. They were just minding their own business and happened to be no thanks when he tried to force them to follow his religion and serve his king. That's very reasonable. Magellan is the one who attacked with his inflated, overconfident ego and vastly underestimated his victims. I was going to say opponents, but they weren't opponents. They were victims here. They were forced to defend themselves, and that's what they did successfully. How bad can you feel for the man, really? So I'm noticing a bit of a pattern here, right? The King of Portugal didn't like Magellan. The captains on the various ships didn't like Magellan. The indigenous people of the island of Mactan didn't like Magellan. It's getting to the point where it's okay, is it all of these various people on various continents, or is it Magellan, right? I'm kind of starting to think there's a chance he just wasn't a very likable guy. And after reading reports of his behavior in the Philippines, I kind of get why. Magellan died on the island of Mactan in the Philippines in April of 1521 after only having completed around 3/4 of the total voyage. He never circumnavigated the earth, but some of his crew did. So what happened next? Well, after this ill-fated battle, Magellan's remaining crew had suffered so many casualties that they had to abandon one of the ships, the Concepcion, because they just didn't have enough men left to sail it. They actually burnt it. They set it on fire and just left it there. So there are 2 ships left, the Victoria and the Trinidad. These ships hightailed it out of there, and they actually made it to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, in November of 1521. Upon arrival there, the Trinidad was in bad shape. It needed a lot of repairs. It was not seaworthy. So it stayed behind to have this work done there on the islands and was eventually captured by the Portuguese and later sank in a storm. The Victoria, the only remaining ship of the expedition, headed back to Spain, sailing around the southern tip and up the west coast of Africa. Almost a whole nother year later, in September of 1522, the Victoria appeared in the same Spanish harbor from which it had departed 3 years earlier. It was battered and sun-bleached with tattered sails, and only 18 men remained on board. That was all that completed the expedition, 18 out of 260. Kiger writes, quote, "They were so weak from malnutrition and exposure that they had trouble walking or speaking. The survivors did manage to bring back a load of spices. It was obvious that Magellan's notion of establishing a westward route to Asia was too slow, costly, and downright dangerous to be practical." End quote. So some of them, 18 of them, did in fact circumnavigate the earth, but not Magellan. Magellan was not with them. These remaining men were led instead by a guy named Juan Sebastian Elcano. Elcano was Spanish. He was born in 1486, so he was 6 years younger than Magellan, in a small fishing village in Spain, and he was the son of a local merchant. So he was, he lived in this fishing village. He was sort of always around water his whole life, and so by the time he was an adult, he was already an experienced sailor and he even had his own boat. Starting in 1509, Elcano started sailing around the Mediterranean, participating in Spanish naval campaigns, much like Magellan was doing for Portugal. By 1518, though, he was in debt and he had to sell his boat. That's also when he heard about Magellan's proposal to the King of Spain, this idea to sail west to reach the Spice Islands, and he was interested. He joined the expedition. So now, if you remember, they had this super rough journey across the Atlantic. It did not start well. It didn't go well the whole time, but it also really didn't start well. They ran into a lot of storms, and then when they got to South America and they tried to sail down the East Coast to find that passage through, it took way, way longer than they thought it would take. And this is when all those mutinies took place, right? Some of the other ship captains and crew started to turn on Magellan and form these plots to kill him. Now, Magellan was able to foil their plans and actually had several of them executed or marooned on islands to starve and whatnot. Elcano was actually part of this mutinous group. He was involved in the plotting to overthrow Magellan to some degree, but he was not executed. And it's believed this was because, maybe he just flew under the radar, whatever, but it's believed that this was because he was actually such a skilled seaman that Magellan could not spare him. He was that much of an asset, right? That he was needed on this mission, and so his life was spared. They make it through South America and into the Pacific Ocean, and finally to the Philippines. Magellan gets himself killed. The crew's in disarray. What do they do now? Their leader is dead. And they had decided to appoint two Spanish guys, Duarte Barbosa and Juan Serrano, to jointly lead the expedition from now on. But they actually both died soon after that during yet another probably unnecessary skirmish with indigenous people, this time in Cebu, which is in the Philippines. So right around this time is also when they go down to one remaining seaworthy ship, the Victoria, which whoever is left piles onto, and they put Juan Sebastian Elcano in charge. Elcano is the one who gets them back to Spain. And this is a rough final leg after having already spent several very rough years at sea. They're very malnourished. They suffer from scurvy and starvation and still more storms. And at one point, they narrowly escape the Portuguese, who are, remember, in competition with Spain over the Spice Islands. And so they're suspicious about, where did this Spanish ship come from? And so finally, 3 years after setting out on this voyage, the Victoria limps back into Spain under Elcano's command. Elcano was recognized at the time as the first person to circumnavigate the earth. Obviously 17 other guys did too, but Elcano was their leader at the time, so he got the credit. King Charles I of Spain granted him an annual pension and a coat of arms with the motto Primus circumdeditsti me, which means, you first encircled me. Apparently, this is the Earth talking to Elcano on the coat of arms. Sincerely, Earth. P.S. Maybe don't try that again, you dumb idiot. So if it was Elcano and the King of Spain, even recognized him and all that, then why do we remember Magellan as the first guy to do this? Well, according to History Skills, quote, historical narratives often emphasize the beginnings of great endeavors rather than their completion, end quote. This expedition was Magellan's brainchild. He came up with the idea, he went to the King of Spain, he secured the funding, he made it happen. And that's what we remember most. It was his thing. Like, oh yeah, the circumnavigation thing, that's Magellan's thing, right? Doesn't really matter that he never successfully completed it. It was still his thing. It also helps that he has a geographical landmark named after him, the Strait of Magellan. And also in a weird way, his death kind of helped to solidify his claim to the fame. It added a tragic hero element to the story, almost like a martyr, right? People love that stuff. People cling to that stuff in epic adventure stories. And so that further tied the credit to Magellan when it was really Elcano, sort of. I mean, it was Elcano if you're considering the first person to circumnavigate the Earth all in one go, all in one voyage. Okay, but there may have actually been another guy who did it first, just broken up into separate voyages. All right, hear me out. Remember Enrique? He was an indigenous Malay man from Malacca whom Magellan had abducted and enslaved during a visit there in 1511, like way before he started this whole circumnavigation of the globe thing. Magellan sort of strung Enrique along from then on to use as a translator during later voyages. He was thinking ahead, right? And so, of course, he brought Enrique on this expedition when they set off west from Spain in 1519. So just think about that for a minute, okay? 1511, Magellan takes Enrique from Malacca, which is in Malaysia, back to Europe with him. They bop around there for a while, and then in 1519, he takes Enrique west from Europe to South America, around South America, across the Pacific Ocean, and back towards his homeland. Evan Andrews explains for History.com, quote, Enrique abandoned the expedition and disappeared shortly after Magellan's death in the Philippines. By then, he was only a few hundred miles short of his point of origin in Malacca. If he ever returned to his homeland, then Enrique may deserve the true credit for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe, end quote. So there's a bit of a question mark there. Did Enrique, or whatever his real name was, did he make those few hundred miles back home once he abandoned the expedition? Did he make it there? I mean, what would you do if you had been kidnapped from your home, taken away from your family and your culture and everything you ever knew? Would you go home again if you were that close? We can't prove it. We can't prove that Enrique made it back to the Malaccas, but something tells me he did. And something tells me he made it there before Elcano limped back into Spain over a year later. And that would make Enrique the real first man to circumnavigate the Earth. Yes, it took separate voyages over the span of a decade, but if we're talking about, like a human body traveling around the circumference of the planet, that was probably Enrique first. Now, he would never have gotten credit for that, of course, but looking back, he really may be the most deserving of that title. This expedition, this crazy idea to go west and end up back in Spain, it really didn't go well. I mean, pretty much everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. They dealt with storm after storm, multiple mutinies, desertion, starvation and thirst, disease, scurvy, violent encounters with indigenous people, the death of multiple leaders, threats from other European forces. It's really remarkable that anyone at all completed the voyage, those 18 men aboard the Victoria, including Elcano and including Pigafetta, right? The chronicler who brought us most of this story. He happened to make that number 18, and he carried with him a written account of all of this. So that's pretty remarkable. It almost seems like an epic failure, when you factor all that in. But really, this expedition was quite groundbreaking when it comes to our understanding of the world. It proved once and for all that the Earth was round. And I will say that again, in case anyone missed it. It proved in 1522, we proved once and for all that the Earth was round. It also proved that North and South America were separate continents and not just like some easterly part of Asia. And it proved that our planet was mostly covered in water. It proved it to the Western world. Anyway, this was the first time that Europeans realized that the Pacific Ocean even existed and just how large it was. Now, of course, as I have said before, the Pacific Islanders were already well aware of that fact. They knew all about the Pacific Ocean, which they already had their own names for, right? Magellan named it that, Pacific. But it already had other names. The Hawaiians called it Moana Nui Akea, which means vast great ocean. The Maori called it Te Moana Nui Akiwa, very similar, which means the great ocean of Kiwa. Kiwa is a Polynesian ocean guardian. So in this story, this epic adventure tale of the great Ferdinand Magellan, we see the same glaring issues that we see in a lot of these stories of early European explorers. We see a guy, this European nobleman, getting credit for something that he didn't actually do, successfully anyway. That credit should have really gone to a different European man, but also possibly to an indigenous Malaysian man. We also see Europeans staking claim on things that they have no right to take. Magellan names the Pacific Ocean, and we still call it that, even though it already had a name. He rolls up into the Philippines and just thinks he can take whatever he wants, right? He takes human beings. Enrique abducts him, enslaves him. He forces the people there to succumb to the authority of the Spanish king by converting to Christianity, and when they won't, he thinks he can just make them do it with violence. But, like we've also seen in a lot of these stories, he underestimates them big time, and he ends up dead. Honestly, this is the real victory of the Magellan story. Not that some random Portuguese turned Spanish guy made it 3/4 of the way around the earth. That's not the victory here. The victory is that this group of people, 1,500 warriors on the island of Mactan, defeated the great Ferdinand Magellan. They defended their island and forced the Spanish back, reducing their numbers such that only 18 of them remained, licking their wounds as they limped back home. The people of Mactan said, "Not today." And this time, in this story at least, it worked. That's the real victory here. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from History.com, History Skills, BBC, and Encyclopedia Britannica. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.